Please welcome Selena and Jason to the S4 main stage.
Hi, I'm Jason Nations from OG&E.
And I'm Selena Larson with Dragos. And today we're going to be talking about using threat intelligence to protect energy infrastructure.
But before we get started, now Dale said this made bombs. So Pale Dieterson, if you're out there, this is your opportunity to show Dale. We're going to take a quick poll. So if we think about this conference, there are really two classes of folks here, right? We've got vendors and we have asset owners. So if you're a vendor, could you raise your hand for me? Come on, get your hands up. I know this is really tweaking your inner introvert, but just go with it. All right, so now just keep your hands up for a moment. If you're a vendor and you have a threat intelligence feed, please keep your hand up. Everyone look around. I'm having a little bit of difficulty seeing. Okay, so we've got a few hands. We got 2 hands, all right. Okay, and then, this may get skewed because I think Dragos brought like 25 people, so there may be more vendors, I don't know. Okay, so now put your hands down. Vendors, you're off the hook for the rest of the presentation. You're good. So now, asset owners, if you have one threat intelligence feed, that could be ICS CERT, it could be your ISAC, it could be Dragos, whatever. Raise your hand for me. Raise your hand for me. All right, everybody look around. Now, if you're an asset owner and you have more than 2 threat intelligence feeds, I want you to raise your hand. Keep your hand up. It's good. Okay, so now look around the room for a minute. And so we just saw quite a few vendors, or you're just going to have to go with this and imagine that we saw quite a few vendors with different threat intelligence feeds. And I think our poll's good there, so we can kind of get back to situation normal. We saw quite a few threat intelligence vendors, and lots of people have more than one threat intelligence feed. And that is an interesting thing, and that's what we're going to talk about. So really what we want to do today is talk about operationalizing threat intelligence as a function. And there's a lot of difficulty in that because there's a lot of noise. And maybe this is a hot take, but it's S4, that's what we do. So we should just think about that not all threat intelligence sources are created equally. And that's not a shot at anybody, it's just what we need to think about. And so as part of our conversation today, we're gonna be challenging our vendors to up their game related to the maturation and the functionality of threat intelligence. And we're gonna challenge our asset owners to expect more and to work and to be better partners related to threat intelligence and how they consume it and how they action on it. So, again, as I mentioned, right, that not all threat intelligence feeds are created equally. We just kind of spitballed a few here that we threw up onto the screen just so that you'd be able to see a few, right? You may have one or many of these, and they do sort of count, and they may tell you if they're vendor sponsored that, oh yeah, clearly that's a threat intelligence feed. Something that I want to talk about, though, as an analog for our conversation is I want you to go back and kind of envision for a moment, that was not a pun intended, because I'm going to talk about SIM. So when we started with SIM way back when, we all had a different set of expectations than we do now. Back then, it was okay to have a relational database. Back then, it was okay to have a clunky Java-based web interface or even a thick client. But if you're buying a SIM today, you would never allow those things that 10 years ago that you would have accepted. The same with anti-malware, right? We would go back to calling it antivirus, and we would be signature-based. But some really smart people figured out that, hey, there's only a few ways to interact with a file. And so why don't we look for behaviors and figure out how do we do it? And so now we're not really signature-based with our more advanced anti-malware solutions out there, right? We're looking for behaviors. And so that same sort of improvement and escalation of capabilities is really what we're after here with our threat intelligence. And so not everything is created equal, and we've got some challenges here. And so just a couple of things that I would say is that there are 2 great examples recently that we can look at that probably illustrate what I'm talking about. So if we look at our government decides that we're going to take military action against an adversary, and then suddenly there is a bunch of well-intentioned, but probably the outcome is noise, right? We get in-task notices, there are calls going on, our security folks are thinking that this is generally situation normal because we can see through these things and it's just a normal day to us. But then our executives or our normal regular users see these things and they get nervous. And that's tough. And then we see, again, the Microsoft releases of the patches where we now see that the NSA has discovered these, and in the time that I previously worked for the government up to now, and all the time I've been paying attention, I've never seen a mandate of 10 days to install patches. And so that leaves us all to tell stories. And if you don't have a specific message, then you're leaving your audience with nothing left but stories to tell themselves, right? We tell ourselves, what do they know that I don't know? They must know something, so we've got to respond. And so we might be distracted from something more important because, again, we don't have context. So my challenge to this, I guess, would be one of our challenges to our vendors is to think about how we can reduce things that might be, I guess maybe we change our signal to noise ratio a little bit and we try to see how we can improve what we're sharing. Again, 10 years ago, the way that we shared with our government partners was like a single one-way interface, right? We all shared and they gave nothing back. So it's awesome what we have today. But I think just around the messaging that we have, I think that there are some opportunities for greater improvement that can improve the community and improve our response and make all of our lives easier.
So to kind of go off of what Jason was saying in terms of the historical execution or understanding of threat intelligence, we say historical, but even now when I go talk to folks about potentially getting a threat intelligence product or integrating it into a SOC, there's kind of some misunderstandings or misconceptions of what TI is. So fundamentally, this idea of exclusively indicators of compromise, right? So these little breadcrumbs that the adversaries will leave behind that you can use to detect potentially malicious activity. Oftentimes, that's what people think of when they think of threat intelligence. Again, this raw data without analysis or context. You can think of, your data feeds or threat intelligence feeds. A lot of the information that is there is largely OSINT. It's a lot of information that is bombarded to you, oftentimes having a brief TLDR, too long didn't read, but this is what happened, but there's no context of how it might affect you or why you should care. And then finally, this idea that it's only useful for technical security operations. We're going to talk about these first two, but this third one I really kind of want to hammer home because it goes back to what Dale was talking about earlier when he kicked off this conference, that we as an ICS security community have failed to successfully educate those folks above us, those executives, the people who are in the position to make business and financial decisions, to invest in security. And historically, this idea of threat intelligence, or even now a lot of people think that it's only useful for technical security operations, right? This very tactical intelligence that you're getting from whoever your TI provider is. But this can be used, the information that you're given should be able to be used and repackaged and delivered up the chain. So you're providing strategic assessments, strategic level assessments for your executives. How are we going to prioritize patching? We're thinking about opening an office in Riyadh. Like, what are some of the threats that they're facing over there, and how might that potentially impact the business decision of moving our offices? So what's great is that it can be used across your organization, and good effective threat intelligence providers make it so that the information is actionable, but it can also be actionable not just from a defender perspective, but your CEO as well.
Right, so again, we've sort of illustrated a few things that I think we would say are challenges, and I completely agree with what Selena has just referred to, right? So an IOC that's simply an IP address without any kind of context is difficult to utilize in today's world.
So the difference between the two, right? So as we're moving from this largely indicator-based threat intelligence into more tactics, techniques, and procedures, focusing on more of behavior analysis, there are some differences. And I'm not here to say that IOCs are useless. That's certainly not the case at all.
Sure.
IOCs are very important, but it's also important to receive them with contextual analysis of where they're appearing and what they mean. So for those of you who might not be familiar, IOCs, indicators of compromise, are enriched descriptions of potential compromise. They usually lack context. They're very easy to modify. You have your hashes, your file names, your domains, your IP addresses. These are things that can be changed frequently. When they're published, for instance, in a public report, an adversary might notice that and really quickly take down their infrastructure and spin up something new. TTPs, on the other hand, this is the fundamental behavior, so the adversary tradecraft, understanding how an adversary operates. For instance, an example of a TTP would be an adversary probing servers with active listeners for RDP, using RDP to move laterally via stolen credentials. This is activity that we have observed by some of our activity groups. And so as a defender, you see this and you say, okay, how would I defend this specific activity regardless of the IP address that is associated with this activity? So you would identify a single RDP logon to multiple hosts in a short amount of time, followed by beaconing activity. Another really good example, actually, that we've seen recently is an activity group that we call Magnalium, doing password spraying activity to electric utilities in North America and elsewhere. So password spraying is kind of just a spray and pray activity. How would we identify that regardless of where it's coming from, right? You could use time-based analysis to identify, 3 failed logon attempts to an RDP or a webmail portal within an hour. And this would potentially flag this malicious activity regardless of, the indicators that are associated with it. So this is the idea of using tactics, techniques, and procedures, and of course, in addition to IOCs, but really focusing on the adversary behavior.
So again, a challenge just as an asset owner, something that I think we all need to think about, right, is just the fatigue associated with the sheer volume of alerts that we receive, right? So if we scroll back to a few slides and we look at the number of different things that are providing data inputs into our shops, that's a lot, and we can get fatigued by them, right? We're all understaffed, right? As a business leader and as a security leader, I can't open the internet without seeing an article telling me how I'll never find enough people to do what I need to get done. So I got to understand that, right? And our analysts can get overwhelmed, and it's difficult for some analysts to be able to prioritize their work, right? And so what we want to try to do is facilitate some mechanism programmatically to enable them to succeed, so that the analyst doesn't have to make a decision about what they want to work on that day because it's interesting or it's in the tool set that they really like, but instead it's based on risk. And we're going to talk about how this entire concept should be a major part of your risk management program at your company. As I said, prioritizing those things to evaluate, prioritizing investigations, a big number of false positives, outdated information that's got you really working on things that are, yesterday it was badguy.com and today it's girlscouts.com. And, you don't want to mess up the cookie supply chain, so you got to be careful there. And information sharing, that's another area, right, that there's some difficulty sharing information, and certainly IOCs, as we know them today, throughout our organization, right? We want to be able to use threat intelligence as a function of risk management, which will enable us to facilitate business decision making, right? Are we going to open an office in Riyadh? Okay, here's what that potentially could entail. Here are the things that are happening, and here's how they impact our business. And if we start thinking in those terms as a security group, then the failure that Dale referenced, which I completely agree with, we've not done a great job as a community to this point, starts to be less magnified, and we're then thought of as a thought leader. It's important for us to be in the room when the big decisions are made, because we can help, again, not to speak to a vulnerability per se, but to the risk involved to the organization or to the company.
So kind of going off of that, right, so alert fatigue, that's something that's very real, right? You don't know where to start, you don't know what to do. And certainly with indicators of compromise, the large streams of data that's coming in, it can be hard to prioritize and hard to parse that information. Where TTPs come into play, looking for behaviors, doing behavior analysis, is helps kind of prioritize that, helps you figure out, where to start and better defend against potentially future attacks that leverage the same behaviors. They're a lot harder for an adversary to change. Changing behaviors is much more difficult than changing an IP address, right? So I wanted to kind of illustrate this. Many of you might be familiar with the Pyramid of Pain by David Bianco. Essentially, it illustrates the indicators that are available and the amount of pain that you would cause a potential adversary by denying the indicators to them. So as you kind of work up the pyramid, right, the hash values at the very bottom, it's very easy. Those are easy to change. They're not going to cause a ton of pain for an adversary. It's very easy to change them and come back and attack a different way. Going up IP addresses, again, domain names, very simple. But as you kind of work up the pyramid, network hosts and artifacts get a little bit more challenging. Tools certainly challenging. An adversary having to learn a completely new tool set because you denied them access to the one that they're using. And then finally, the actual behaviors, the TTPs, how they are executing their attacks, regardless of the tools that they're using and regardless of the indicators of compromise. If you're able to defend against the specific behaviors, it makes it very difficult for an adversary to successfully execute attacks. They can be used, TTPs, both for host and network defense. And I do want to point out here, threat intelligence providers, regardless of who you're using, should be providing that type of defensive recommendations and mitigation information in the reports. We're going to talk a little bit about that when we kind of walk through a potential fake scenario here, using threat intelligence to help figure out what's going on in terms of incident response. But from a defensive perspective, it's really important that you can get actionable information from that, and delivering TTPs along with how to defend against them. So at Dragos, for instance, what we do is we turn our the TTPs that we identify and the behaviors that we hunters and analysts are identifying into what we call threat behavior analytics. And essentially, this is kind of just packaging behavior and putting it into our threat detection and response platform so that we can detect a TTP. So a good example would be IEC 61850, discovery, and then scan. So with this, it would be a device using our broadcast defined host followed by traffic on TCP port 102 from the same host. Again, this is associated with Electrum activity. Andy was on stage here yesterday talking about sandworm and crash override. Electrum is the activity group that we associate with the crash override malware attack. And like Electrum, with a lot of our other activity groups, all of our other activity groups, we're parsing their behaviors, we're picking out behaviors that defenders can very easily identify and defend against, and kind of codifying that into reports and then potentially the platform. So across the board, what that means is if you're defended against the behaviors, regardless of the group, but certainly it's generally associated with an adversary, you can be proactively defended against any activity that will be using similar behaviors. Actually, I want to give a shout out right now to MITRE ICS attack framework that was just released. I think Austin Scott is going to be talking about it later today. But MITRE did a really cool thing where they basically introduced a framework of these types of behaviors that you can defend against from an ICS cyber attack perspective. So they did a really good job of kind of laying that out for defenders to have an easy way to sort of piece together a full attack cycle and being able to sort of map behaviors and ways to sort of defend against them. So little shout out to a talk later if you guys are interested in going to that.
Okay, so as I've sort of alluded to previously, right, we want to take a programmatic approach to threat intelligence. As a business leader, I'm always looking for things that can help me to make my organization better, make myself better. And so I read this great book called The Culture Code that just talked about how if you don't intentionally work toward a goal and build that into what you're trying to do intentionally, then you'll never get there, right? So you've got to understand. So what I would posit, maybe this is hot take number 2 or 4, I don't know, I've lost count now. We want to be thinking organizationally about how we can have a program around TTPs as a bigger part of our risk management function, right? This is a capability, right? I want you to walk away from here with nothing else but to think that threat intelligence is not just a tool. I have a threat intel feed. Great. It's got to be a capability, right? This is not a box checking exercise for us asset owners to say, I have 19. They're not baseball cards. Maybe we could go with that, right? Like just having them doesn't do anything if I can't utilize the data points that they're providing. And so we want to think about threat intelligence has to show activity, but it's also got to help us to know what our countermeasures. So there have been great talks here at S4 over the last several years around HAZOPs or cyber PHA. And that's something we're at OG&E, we're on that journey, trying to work to look at our kind of consequence events. And so I would say that I think threat intelligence should help me understand what my consequence events are based on behavior, and then help me to know and advise me on what my countermeasures or risk mitigation strategies might be. And those, again, are not all technical per se, right? It ought to be shared up and down the organization so that, again, we want to elevate the level of the conversation. We want to change the way of being for our analysts to be thinking more about how does this impact our business? How does this impact our organization? How does this impact our mission as an organization? And how can I use this information that I've got now, this threat intelligence, to help us make decisions? It's got to be communicated in a way that can be consumed by folks both up and down the organization. And if we can really do that and have information that we can share, then we can make a meaningful contribution to the goals of our organization instead of just being a cost center. So now I'm going to dive in here to OG&E's approach to threat intelligence. So as I've said, we're trying to make it a program. Please do not hear me say that we're perfect, because we're not. This is an iterative process, and we're working on it every day, trying to get a little bit better than we were yesterday. And so as a leader, you have to understand that you've got to be willing to invest in your talent. You have to be willing to invest in your analysts. Think about it. Just in the last 10 years, the proliferation of security tools that are available to each of us, right? I can remember when I started at OG&E and what I had visibility to and the tools and capabilities that I had. And if I look back there to where I am now, they're radically different. But one of the things that we often foul up on in implementations of these tools is the training associated with them and the documentation in their use. We have pockets of tribal knowledge. I guarantee if we raise the house lights again, don't do it, but if we did and we made you squirm and had to raise your hands again, you would agree that there are pockets of tribal knowledge within your organization that are tough to get out. And so you've got to be able to be intentional about this. You've got to train your folks. You've got to invest in their personal development and in their understanding of the way tools can be used to great effect to help the organization. You want to train the entire team to try to get your senior analysts to pour into your junior analysts so that there's a level playing field, so that you're not relying on the same 3 guys all the time when you have 10 guys. Or 4 guys, or however many you have.
Or gals.
Or gals. Excuse me, I'm euphemistically using guys. It's your team. Thank you. I appreciate you catching me on that. And so analysts have to be capable, too, of more than just entering an IP address into a SIM. I think we probably, with enough effort, could get a monkey to be able to enter IP addresses into a SIM if we worked at it hard enough. And there's way more to security than just that. And I don't know, I mean, that we're like mining gold in Minecraft or something at that point, or something that we're just not, we've given ourselves a job, not a capability, and I don't know that that's really valuable. So the team's got to have run books that are documenting the use of your tools, and then you've got them integrating the intelligence data into them, and then you got to continue to refine those, right? These run books get stale based on the way that tools change and capabilities change, or behaviors of bad guys change, and you've got to be able to then say, everybody on the team, make sure you're looking and you're familiar and you're going with these. And then the next step and challenge for you as an organization is to take the data from your run books and integrate it into your formal incident response procedure. So we had a great talk here on the main stage yesterday about the ICS framework and the need to templatize and the need to have clearly defined roles and responsibilities. Well, this is it. If you integrate these things into process, and then integrate those processes into your incident response procedures, when it comes time to have to respond, everybody on the team knows exactly how to respond and who to respond, and then that facilitates communication. That communication comes from the team to the incident commander. If I were the incident commander, then I would be able to then extrapolate some things that are known knowns and then be able to move that up my chain, dealing only in facts and dealing with what I know and how I know this is going to affect us, so that I'm not hanging out there on some ragged edge or a limb or whatever cliche you want to use and having to potentially overcommit and underprovide. So those are things that we're doing there. That's just kind of the ethos of our approach. And so I mentioned run books. One of these days I'm going to figure out the right button. So this is just a high-level kind of redacted example of some of our run books at OG&E. So we use Microsoft Teams. It's a great sharing platform. That's what works for us. If you've got something different, fantastic. And so we have a run book for every one of our functions. And since we're talking about threat intelligence, we brought one of our threat intel providers up. I've got that, our Dragos panel I'm pointing down to you can't see it, just look there. I've got our Dragos part of it up. And so we're trying to train our analysts. And this gets into deep level, right? Who, what, when, where, why, how. How can I utilize this? It's funny, right? We all get new resources. And you get a new guy and he shows up on a Monday, and if you're not careful, he sits there for 2 weeks before anybody can really utilize him because you haven't started training. And so at OG&E, we have a highly iterative training process for our security analysts so that we can incorporate them and get them from the walk to run, or walk to crawl to run, or crawl to, let's go with it, crawl to walk to run to sprint as quickly as possible. Even if you bring in a seasoned security person, there's still inevitably training that's specific to the way that you do business. And so these are our run books, and they're very detailed and very documented, and we have people accountable for working through them. And our threat intelligence capabilities are incorporated into our run books. Then the next level step, right, is taking your run books and then putting them into your formal incident response procedures. You've got to have behavioral and event-driven activity into your investigative processes. You should be thinking about, okay, so if this is happening, what does that really mean? And how could someone use that against me? And again, thinking to the HAZOPS or the cyber PHA mentality or process, you want to understand how that could impact your business. It's not enough to say that's an RDP attack. Okay, great, what does that mean? How can I contextualize that? If I don't have Windows, an RDP attack, I don't know. So I think there are lots of different things there that we can miss if we don't put them in our procedures. And typically when we think of incident response in the real high, difficult procedures, the difficult response scenarios, if you've got things written down, you don't have to remember them in the heat of battle. And again, looking at behaviors and contextualizing what this means and how it could have an impact is the job of an incident commander, but it can make having that written down and clear to your team can make the job of the incident responder much, much easier. And they don't chase ghosts because you'll be saying, wait, now what would that mean and how does that work? And it's a big problem and a big challenge. And my hot take here would be that you need to make sure that you're integrating that and taking time to do it. We're going to give you a scenario now in practice. And just one caveat that I'd like to say, right, is that this is, do you guys remember in Law and Order way back in the day, there would be, then NBC would pump that up by saying like, ripped from the headlines. Okay, so we're trying to do that here, but this isn't an actual event. No dragons were harmed in the making of this scenario. This is just something that we put together that could happen in the day of a life of an organization or an asset owner. We get contacted by a well-meaning government agency, and they've got information for us, potentially on an adversary wanting to do something to one of our networks. And so that makes things challenging. So I'll tell you what we're going to do is we'll advance, and then we're going to play some audio.
Hi, Jason. This is John Johnson from the field office. I think we have an issue. Will you please call me back immediately? Thank you. Bye.
So we get John Johnson from the field office calling us. If you've ever gotten this call, it can really ruin your day, right? You came in that morning and you're like, I'm going to catch up on, think of it, whatever it was. And then you get this call and your world stops because you've got to now go respond. So don't hear me criticizing that a government agency is trying to help me, because that's not the case. But what you got to understand is that the government agency has oftentimes a different mission than you do. And so they might be limited in what they can share. And so we've sort of glibly given you here a redacted line of an IP address, because often that's what will happen, right? You'll get told something to the effect of, well, we'd like to give you more information. We'd like to answer your question, but it's subject to an official investigation that we can't release at this time, right? And it's important that you have relationships with your local government representatives and then even our national representatives. They are incredibly valuable. And in a scenario, let's say a friend of mine got this call. That friend was really happy that he had spent time to develop relationships with his three-letter agencies in the town where he operated, because people gave him a heads up. Because if he hadn't gotten the heads up, then he wouldn't know anything. So it's incredibly important. But if you think about what you're probably going to get if this happens, is you're going to get maybe an IP address or 2 or 3 or 4 and a date range. And I want you to just think about that for a moment, because you're thinking, man, that's a needle in a haystack. But you're wrong. That is a needle in a stack of needles that look exactly like each other, because you don't know. You have no context. You have no way of really understanding what this is, right? I have seen things recently in notifications from threat intel providers that happen to have the same CIDR range as a country that may be adversarial toward us. And if we get that type of information, then we're sort of in ready, fire, aim mode, right? We're going to shoot everything first, and then we'll go figure out what it was that we shot after we make sure it's killed. And that's a terrible approach because it could cause interruptions or impact your business in a way that maybe you didn't intend and certainly wouldn't want to do. So we get this information. So assume we have an IP address and a date range. So now we've got tools, and so now we've got to go figure out, okay, what do we know? And when we're dealing with this, it's very important that we are dealing with what we know. As an incident responder, right, I'm interested in who, maybe not even who, right? So the what, why, when, and where. The who is honestly immaterial for me to a certain extent. I think there are other agencies or other entities or other organizations that might have more stake in the who, but I really care about what, why, when, where, and how, right? What's it doing to my organization? When is it taking place? How is that going to impact us? What are my mitigating controls? What are the things that I'm doing that can prevent this? How can I understand what's happening to really truly understand and triage and mitigate the damage? And so in our scenario here, we use our threat intelligence feed. We got an IP address, just one. And so now we're going to use our threat intelligence, a second source, to try to help us to gather context of what that might mean. So based on our review of our intelligence source here, so for the purposes of our exercise, we see that, oh, this is tied to an activity group. What are they trying to do? So now I can go look for the behaviors of what they're trying to do, possibly or possibly not. For like I said, badguys.com today, girlscouts.com tomorrow. How do I respond and to really understand that? Did you have something you wanted to add there on that one?
Yeah, so also on the following slide, I think we're going to kind of dive into that too. But once you're able to sort of identify that it is tied to this group, you can go even deeper into all of the related reporting, right? So you have an entire backlog of information that is related to the potential activity that you're observing. So again, for the purposes of this exercise, we're using an example report from Dragos, but whoever your threat intelligence provider is, when you receive reporting from them, it should be immediately actionable, right? So you should be getting the information, the behavior and a behavior assessment, what are they doing? Certainly indicators of compromise are going to be in there as we have here on the slide. But you also have a lot of additional information that can add context, which is so important.
Yep.
The context really drives home the importance of the report, how it is going to apply to you as the asset owner, as the recipient of the intelligence, and then what you're going to tell your defenders to do to take action on the intelligence. So you can see in this example report, it's kind of just chunked up a little bit, but we have this mitigations piece, right? So kind of going back to when we talked about TTPs that can be used for defensive recommendations. We'll provide host and network recommendations that you can implement immediately. They're information that your defenders can look at and say, are we doing this already? If not, we should be doing this. How are we going to do this? How difficult is it going to be? Sometimes it's super easy and you can kind of check that off and say, we're done. We mitigated this potential threat. We also include, a screenshot of the activity. Obviously, it's very useful to kind of see, what the information is. Providing an example, for instance, if it's a phishing war, you can say, have we received any phishing emails with the similar content of this email? Being able to kind of look out for that and use that in your investigation. And then finally here, this idea of continued tradecraft evolution. So we talked about behaviors, we talked about activity groups sticking to similar behaviors. Oftentimes they'll be using new tools. They'll be using new things to kind of augment the behaviors that we track. So sometimes it'll be new tradecraft that we have observed, but they're executing it in a similar way that we have seen previously. So kind of adding that context again from both a defensive sort of tactical perspective, but also from a strategic perspective. perspective, right? So to have that strategic intelligence that, goes beyond just the defender level, something that a recipient can sort of send up the chain. Why should my manager care about this? Why should our CISO care about this? Why should our executives care about this? And I want to point out here too, we're using this as an example. This is, a threat, a Magnalium, it's a technical report. It contains information. Sometimes threat intelligence simply says this is not something that is what it seems to be, right? So certainly at Dragos, but I know the threat intelligence community at large too. I mean, I don't know if you follow the community on Twitter. We certainly, talk a lot, say a lot of things. But a lot of the things that we do say push back on this idea of FUD, right? Like fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Yes.
And what we try to do and provide in our reporting is oftentimes you'll see things that come through, whether it's a news item or whether it's a report from another security company that kind of describes activity. And oftentimes we'll get people kind of concerned about that. Oh my gosh, the so and so is going to take down the electric grid. With fingers on the switches, they can black out the entire United States. What we do oftentimes, a lot of our reporting provides assessments that's like, here is the realistic threat. Here's the activity that we're seeing. Here's what you can tell your manager that's going to come down and say, why aren't we on this? Why aren't we defending against this? What's going on? And you can kind of deliver them a threat intel product that says, look, like here's a summary of the activity. Here's the realistic threat. And here, as defenders or our operations team, here's how we're already defended against what the real threat is, not necessarily what is kind of being made out to be. So I kind of want to point that out too, right? As we're talking about communicating sort of up the chain and effectively educating the executives or folks in management, that's a really important part too, right?
Sure is.
Certainly separating the sort of FUD from realistic threats.
Yeah, being able to dial that down. And again, as I said, this should be a function of your risk management program at your organization. Being able to remove the superfluous information, let's go with that, and being able to get it down to the context to, okay, here's how this is going to really impact our company. This is going to impact our operations. This is how it's going to impact our balance sheet. We should understand those things and know them. And again, right, so an IP address by itself is tough. And we want to be really thinking about how we can deal in the knowns and use this to help us to manage the risk associated with it. So in this situation, in our Dick Wolf ripped from the headlines scenario, we've got an IP address. And because we were able to go back and get some contextual information, we found, hey, this is a group that seems to be targeting other North American energy entities. And so if we're a utility, and now we see that we've got some of this activity, depending on what part of the business it's in, it could have a different impact. If it's on a corporate system, well, maybe it's just Tuesday and you image the machine and you keep moving if that's all you find. If it's in a control system at a power plant, well, that could potentially impact the plant operations. If it's somehow in the control system, I'm talking for a friend, it could happen to OG&E, maybe. And so if it's in your EMS environment affecting the bulk electric system, then you've got a whole other fun bag of cats there with having to deal with the reporting requirements of that. But I can contextualize that now, and I can make business decisions on it based on the impact. And so if I'm using this as a function of risk management and not as a oh gosh, we have to kill all instances of 185.217.0.218, and if I don't have them, then I'm not really under attack. Right? Because none of us would say that, yeah, if you definitely don't have that one IP address, then you're not under attack in any way, shape, or form ever by anyone, ever. Right? So you can look for other potential avenues of compromise that can include phishing, right? So now we've seen the specifics of a phishing campaign that we can go grab our environment to see. Did we have this? Did we see any instances of this or anything like it? That might help us to know, oh, that guy was affected, or no, it doesn't look like we're good there, but we see password spraying, right? And we've had repeated attempts to mine passwords in our environment. So you've got to deal with the known. And to really get what you know, then you've got to contextualize. It's got to be beyond where we are. So this is a challenge that I'd issue along the same analog as the SIM and a malware that I mentioned earlier, right? So threat intelligence vendors, and you're out there. What we need is to be able to raise the bar and increase the maturity level of what we're providing to our customers. We need to contextualize information. We need to dial down on the FUD that just gets people nervous and make sure that we're providing information, because if I have to use every bit of my street cred with my executive leadership to be able to get them to believe in something, and I cry wolf, but it doesn't happen, well, that's going to really be a challenge for me to continue to be a leader in that organization. Or if we look at the mitigating, so go back to the HAZOPs and the cyber PHA thought process, right? So if I'm convinced that patching is the only way I'm going to solve this problem, I'm not really addressing the problem here in this case, because we're talking about things that don't really necessarily have anything to do with patching at this point, based on what we know, right? So that we can go back to the Trisis example, right? Because patching would not have solved that. So if I spend all of my resources to mitigate risk that I don't necessarily, that aren't reflective of what the true risks are, then I'm probably wasting resources, and I'm hurting my cause and hurting my organization, because I could probably use those resources better in some way.
And part of those resources is directly contacting whoever your threat intel provider or the services that you work with. So if you were, in the event of this happening, an asset owner can call us up and say, hey, this is what I found. And I think we have a recording of that potentially happening.
So we're just going to go here in just a moment. We'll play some audio. But what we know, right, is that we've got to deal with the known. And if you've got this third parties that are attached to your processes, then things get easier. So let's play some audio for just a moment.
Hey, this is Jason Masons with OG&E. We just got some information from our local field office that's potentially concerning.
Hey, Jason. What did you find? Can you share anything with us? I'll see if we can help.
So the agents were kind of vague, but they said that we were potentially targeted by a malicious actor, but they couldn't share any details with us. So I have an IP address and a date range. And based on a review of Worldview, it looks like it might be associated with Magnalium.
Okay. Can you give me the IP address and the date range, if that's possible?
Yeah, sure. It's 185, the IP address is 185.217.0.
It's like I'm in a McDonald's.
.218. And the date range was November of 18 all the way to April of 2019.
All right. Got it. Let me check on my end, and I will get back to you as soon as I can.
Great. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm not exactly sure how that came out, if it sounded like incident response in the McDonald's drive-thru or not. That's kind of how it sounded on the stage, but I hope that you were able to hear that. So essentially what that was is just our call between what we know and what we have, and then we're reaching out to a provider as part of our incident response program. And so we reached out and we said, hey, we've looked, this is what we know right now, we're dealing only in the knowns, and then we're moving forward with that. And so let's get to a second piece of audio here that'll kind of follow up, and then we'll kind of wrap and go here. So can we play a second piece
thanks
of
for
audio?
emailing me the extra info on Magnalium. So it turns out we were able to find some evidence of a desktop having connected to that IP address I gave you, the 185.217 number. It was back in October of 2018, and it had displayed some malicious PowerShell activity. So we found it and we remediated it. But at that point, we weren't able to connect all the dots to determine more about it. It looks like now we know. So your info was really great, by the way, and we were able to, we're going to be able to use that really well to share with our executive leadership. So thanks a lot.
Oh, yeah, no problem. Super happy to hear that. Did you find additional evidence of compromise or any behaviors that sort of deviated from what we had already reported on in Worldview? I'm just curious, if there's anything additional that we should catalog.
Well, nothing really at this point, but we'll keep an eye on it, and we'll certainly let you know if we do.
All right, sounds good. Guess you don't need to invoke your IR retainer for this?
No, I don't think so, not yet. We're going to keep investigating, and if there is something crazy that happens or we give you more details, we'll let you know.
Cool. All right, sounds good, Jason. Talk to you soon.
All right, thanks.
Okay, so I hope that came through. I'm really nervous now that we've just we got the survey, Dale, but we have died on the audio. I can't tell. I think that came through. So essentially what you heard were calls where we're wrapping up our processes, and the result of this investigation, because we could contextualize one small carrot of information that we received from our well-meaning government friends, we were able to pretty quickly understand what was going on and triage the event, and then we we're pretty well into our incident response program at this point because we are reaching out to a third party, and it's written in our procedures that we have some forensics and other providers that can help us do stuff. And so if you don't have that in your procedures, then I would encourage you to. Couple things that I would share though. So being able to contextualize the data allows you to lower your response times. And that is truly the name of the game for you, right? You want to lower your response times. In this instance, right here, right, we went from days and weeks or months to just hours. And then our response and remediation timeline went way down from weeks or days to hours or maybe days. And part of that timing is around change control and documentation, right? We were able to rapidly respond. We could do things well. And so this also enabled us to have some context that we could share with our business around what's actually happening. So we could effectively communicate, we could respond appropriately, we could understand how the impacts to our risk are taking place, and then we can make sure that we are dealing with the situation properly. Whatever policies and procedures we need to put in place to deal with these or future adversaries, we could do that because we took a systematic approach. And so that's really important.
Great. And to just quickly wrap up, all threat intelligence isn't created equal, right? You have your indicator feeds, you have your data feeds, and then you have your robust and contextualized threat intelligence that delivers actionable information that you can use and integrate immediately. So that's really important when you're thinking about doing that within your own company, having that conversation, making sure that whatever you're getting from whoever your TI provider is can make it easier for you to respond, to defend, detect, and provide better security.
Yeah, and I would just wrap up by just saying again, you've got to be intentional about this. As an asset owner, be intentional about making this a programmatic element and a capability of your organization. And as asset owners, we should expect more from our vendors, and we should partner more with our vendors to make sure that we're helping them to understand what our real needs are, and then vendors can work to try to mature the capabilities with threat intelligence as a concept, just like we've done with other security technologies, that we have better visibility and better capability today than when we really started to work on them. So thanks a bunch for your time. I think they're going to clap us off stage. We really appreciate you being here, and we'd love to catch you maybe at the Cabana sessions.
I will definitely be there.
And,
yes.
And thanks again.
Thanks,
appreciate
guys.
you.